Hi there, and welcome to Facebook Live. I'm Paul J. Bennett, author of the Heir to the Crown series and also a new series called The Frozen Flame. And I'm here today to talk about some historical movies that I thought were of some particular interest. So we started off, this was a hard list to actually make because a lot of times I was thinking of movies and I couldn't remember the name of the movie. So it took a while to actually dig some of this up, and I'm sure I've missed movies as well. So I decided to put this in chronological order, and so I'm going to start off going way back to 1935, believe it or not. Now, my first couple of movies here all have the same star, Errol Flynn, who you may be familiar with. And the first movie that came up, one of my favorites, Captain Blood. It takes place after the English Civil War, where he is basically sent to the Caribbean, or Caribbean, depending how you want to pronounce it. And of course, he becomes a pirate. Very good movie, entertaining. That was followed up the very next year in 1936 by The Charge of the Light Brigade. And in this one, they actually, Basil Rathbone, by the way, was in Captain Blood. He is also in The Charge of the Light Brigade, plays a really good villain in that movie as well. I will warn you, it's a little bit not politically correct. Basil Rathbone is playing a villain who is, I believe he's supposed to be Arabic or something. So it's not quite acceptable nowadays, but you have to remember the times in which these were made. 1938, The Adventures of Robin Hood, another Errol Flynn, and Basil Rathbone yet again as the villain. In this case, he's just an Englishman, so everything works fine. Some great sword fights there. I actually have a copy of that one on Blu-ray. It was digitally remastered. It's an amazing quality film. Going forward, 1940, we have The Seahawk. So this takes place in Elizabethan England. Now, all of these movies, well, obviously Robin Hood isn't necessarily historically accurate. Charge of the Light Brigade is based around the events, but a highly fictionalized story. The Seahawk is about the Elizabethan period, but other than being set in that time period, it does mention, of course, the Spanish, including the Spanish Armada, but it's not meant to be any historical film. Now, most of these films I'm going to talk about today are not necessarily historically accurate. There are some that are very noteworthy in being so. Especially when we get to some of the newer ones. But I picked them mostly because of either entertainment value or something in the movie that is particularly interesting, which I'll go over as I get to them. Now, going forward, The Seahawk, of course, was made while Britain and Canada and much of Europe was at war. The Americans hadn't entered the war yet. 1942, we have a movie with James Cagney. It's called Captains of the Clouds. Now, James Cagney plays a bush pilot in Canada. This is the story takes place just as the war is beginning, and he ends up getting involved with the Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which is big news around here because a lot of the training was done at a place called Clinton, which is very close to where I live. And so that's very interesting. It also was made as a bit of a propaganda piece to sort of show Americans the way forward into the war. And so on. Of course, they didn't enter until late 1942, until after, of course, Pearl Harbor. Or is that 41? I got my dates mixed up there. Now, going forward, I've got some pretty strange movies on the list, and there's one here in particular called The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp. So, first of all, Colonel Blimp was a comic strip character in England. And this is a movie loosely based on that character. So Colonel Blimp is this really old guy, obviously a colonel. It's World War II. They're doing a sort of a training exercise, and they capture him in essentially like a sauna. And then he relates to them about his past. And he's been in the Boer War and the First World War and so on. So a lot of the movie is flashback. So you think he's just this bumbling idiot, but in fact, he's got a lot of service behind him and so on. So that's a very interesting one. I stumbled across that one almost by accident, but was very entertaining to watch. Another movie It came out in 1944 that I quite enjoyed. This one's got a more serious aspect to it. Now it goes by two names. It was called The Way Ahead, but also The Immortal Battalion. And it stars David Niven, who was a pretty big star in England. This is an English movie. And it's about essentially a group of recruits who are brought together after the loss at Dunkirk. They're sent overseas. I believe they're sent to Africa, but they don't make it there. Things happen along the way. And it's got a very English sort of feel to it. Their whole idea is that war is not glorious, but it's like, well, let's roll up our sleeves and get the job done. So it's kind of a matter-of-fact look and keeping that, keep calm and stay British mentality to it. Very entertaining movie. Now, when we go to the post-war years, I can see a trend here because there's still a lot of war movies coming out because, of course, a lot of the people going to the movies were from that generation. But also we have a lot of more historical movies and some based on classics. 1951, we have Gregory Peck starring in Captain Horatio Hornblower. Now, I was a big fan of the new Hornblower series with Ian Grufford, which was done by Arts Entertainment along with, I believe it was the BBC. This one is based on two of the books. Very entertaining movie. Gregory Peck plays the gruff commander of a frigate. He gets involved in some politics. So it's entertaining in that respect. And he gets the character of Horatio Hornblower down pretty good. I mean, having read the books, I really enjoyed his portrayal of the character. Moving on to 1952, we have Ivanhoe. Now, Ivanhoe is based on the novel by Sir Walter Scott. This is in my opinion, this is probably the best version of Ivanhoe. And I'm not necessarily saying it's closest to the book or anything, but it's, in terms of a movie, it's got everything. It's got action, adventure, a little bit of romance for those that want it. It's got knights fighting. Some of the fight scenes are probably a little out there because movies of that time period, they tended to speed up the film in order to make it look more epic. So that stars Robert Taylor as Ivanhoe, Sir Wilfrid of Ivanhoe, and Elizabeth Taylor, no relation, by the way, even though they share the same name, and she plays Rebecca. And that's a very important part if you're familiar with the story of Ivanhoe. Now, Ivanhoe has been remade quite a few times. I think 3 or 4, actually. Some of the others are pretty good, too. I think I'll stick with the original as my favorite, though. 1953, the very next year, we have Robert Taylor again. He was a pretty big star. Knights of the Round Table. It's one of my favorites. He plays Sir Lancelot. And it's got the same Basil Rathbone, once again, playing a villain. In this case, he's playing a Moor or Saracen. And by today's standards, it would have been better to cast someone else. He does make a good villain, though. He's got the presence. But once again, this was a sign of the times when the movie was made. The story itself is entertaining enough if you can look past that. It's got some intrigue and so on. So I think if you're looking for an old movie, I've got this one actually. I bought it on iTunes, and so I got it digitally, and it's a nice, crisp, fresh copy of it, which is nice to see. Going forward, 1954, the next year, 2 movies I want to mention. These kind of fall into the kind of a little hokey by today's standards. If you're looking for grim reality, you're not going to get it here. Same with Knights of the Round Table, by the way. The Black Knight with Alan Ladd. So Alan Ladd was an American actor, so you got to kind of get over his American accent. He's a smith, which is kind of like Kingdom of Heaven in a sense. But anyway, he's a smith who, the castle gets attacked. He is blamed for being a coward, even though he goes to try to get help. And he essentially arms himself as a knight and becomes the Black Knight. It's all about him and his quest to sort of regain his name and so on. So it's another one of these, I guess, acrobatic movies that I should mention there. The Black Shield of Falworth. Now, this is another movie I don't remember. I remember seeing this and enjoying it. I don't remember a lot of the plot. It has been a number of years since I've seen it. It has Tony Curtis and Janet Leigh, who, by the way, were married at the time they made this movie. Janet Leigh is more famous for being in the movie The Birds with Alfred Hitchcock, and she's been in lots of. And by the way, she's the mother of Jamie Lee Curtis as well. So anyway, the Black Shield of Falworth, another one of these entertaining romp around, kind of in the Errol Flynn sense, although this was much later than Errol Flynn's prime period. Moving to 1955, two really good movies, really good for different reasons. The first one I'm going to talk about is a British movie called The Cockleshell Heroes. Now, this is about the actual beginnings of the Special Boat Service. So a lot of people have heard of the SAS, the Special Air Service, the anti-terrorist group. What a lot of people don't know is there's another group called the Special Boat Service. Now, they weren't originally called that, of course. They were formed in World War II to carry out commando raids using these collapsible, you would call them kayaks by today's... Tilly apparently likes that movie. So it's a very entertaining movie. It takes them through their training and how people think they're nuts. And then, of course, they have a rather successful raid and prove the value of this. Another movie, and I got to say, this is one of my favorite movies, The Court Jester. Danny Kaye at his most funny. It's a riff on all kinds of movies, Robin Hood, Knights of the Round Table, take your pick. It's a medieval caper, if you like. Danny Kaye is a jester who is mistaken for a Robin Hood type of character called the Fox, and hilarity ensues. Very, very funny movie. Once again, Danny Kaye is a genius when it comes to physical comedy. 1957, we get a lot more serious. I believe this one won several Academy Awards, The Bridge on the River Kwai. So this is Alec Guinness, and for those of you that are too young, that's the old Obi-Wan Kenobi, not as opposed to the young Obi-Wan Kenobi. Alec Guinness was a huge star in England. He's done many, many movies. In fact, I could have made a list of his movies, but maybe that's another time. Bridge on the River Kwai takes place in the Pacific Theater of Operations. I forget which country it's in. But anyway, it's about prisoners of war. And the Japanese officers forced them to build a bridge to support a Japanese railway. And there's also William Holden is in it as well, and he plays an American who manages to escape the camp, and then they send him back with a bunch of commandos to blow up the bridge. Very good movie. It's a long movie, so be aware of that. And if I remember in the theatrical release, I believe there's a big intermission. They don't do intermissions much anymore. In fact, I don't think they've done them for years. So you have to be aware of that. 1958, we have The Vikings. So this is Kirk Douglas and Tony Curtis. And man, if you're looking for historical accuracy, this is not it, okay? This is another romp it's a swashbuckler with Vikings. And you get to see Kirk Douglas running around with an eye patch. And Tony Curtis, I believe, is supposed to be a Saxon or something raised by the Vikings. I can't remember now. It's a bit corny in places. Still an entertaining movie. Once again, though, if you're expecting, a serious look at Vikings, it's not a comedy, don't get me wrong. This is just sort of a pure action movie from that time period. 1959, we have one of Charlton Heston's big movies, Ben-Hur. Now, this is an epic movie. Of course, there are religious overtones in the movie, but and it's important to the plot, of course. But just from a spectacle point of view, you get to see galleys fighting each other. It's a very entertaining movie. It's very theatrical. It's a big screen, big budget movie, and it shows. Now, I have not seen the remake of Ben-Hur. My understanding is it was not very good. It didn't do very well at the box office. And quite frankly, it's one of those movies that why would you redo it? The original was so good, and I think people enjoyed that. 1960, the very next year, Kirk Douglas comes back, Spartacus. I am Spartacus. So the original Spartacus, kind of on a Ben-Hur scale, I guess. You cannot compare this to the miniseries Spartacus, other than having the character of Spartacus and the escaped slaves. It's very, very different. It is, of course, about them fighting the Roman Empire. Entertaining. There were scenes which at the time were considered fairly risque, I guess would be the term. By today's standards, it's nothing. Um, uh, but it's an entertaining movie, and it's very famous for the ending. I don't want to give the ending away, but the phrase "I am Spartacus" comes into play, and it's kind of one of those famous things. 1961. Here's another favorite of mine: The Guns of Navarone. This is based on an Alistair MacLean novel, and you'll see a bunch of those. They went through a time period where they made a whole bunch of them. The Guns of Navarone is about some German gun emplacements in, I believe it's the Greek islands they have naval guns implanted in like the side of a cliff, and they're destroying Allied shipping in the area. And so they send a special task force in. Now, they did a follow-up to this, Force 10 from Navarone, which I don't have on my list, unfortunately, but it also featured some characters from the first one. It was made a lot later, and it had Harrison Ford. It was a good movie as well. That's one I actually forgot to put on my list. 1962, we have the epic Lawrence of Arabia, Peter O'Toole. This is a big, sweeping, epic movie. Peter O'Toole was the main actor, of course. Alec Guinness plays a big part, playing an Arab, actually the king of Saudi Arabia, I believe it is at the time. I can't remember if that was the name of the kingdom. Once again, you've got an English actor playing an Arabic nationality here, so it's a little odd. Here, apparently Diana has agreed the new Ben-Hur sucked. So I'm backed up with that, which is nice to see. Let's see, Lawrence of Arabia, yeah, very good movie. Another one of my favorites. Now, Lawrence of Arabia is not a movie I could watch a lot. It's very long. I believe it's like a 3-hour movie, if I'm not mistaken. So it's quite lengthy. Same year, though, we have another movie, The Longest Day, one of my favorite World War II movies. This has an all-star cast, tons of people. Of course, John Wayne is probably the biggest name in the movie. Still in black and white, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe there's a colorized version out there, I'm not sure. And it's about D-Day and all the events around D-Day. Oh, there we go. Lawrence of Arabia is 3 hours and 48 minutes. That's like, that's almost, what, 2/3 of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, I think. Just kidding. That's a long movie. Now, The Longest Day, like I said, all-star cast with well-known actors, and it's there's a whole bunch of movies based on the book by Cornelius Ryan. Cornelius Ryan, I believe that's the name of the author. Pardon me if I get that wrong. Anyway, it is done almost like a documentary. And the nice thing about this is it helps you understand what was going on, where they were attacking, why they were attacking, and all the things around it. I'm reminded recently, I watched the new movie Dunkirk, and one of the things that I found annoying about the Dunkirk was the scenes were great, but I don't think they did a really good job of explaining what was happening. You got the impression they were escaping, but you didn't get a picture of the overall picture of the war, and I think that's something that some of these older war movies did a lot better. Now, I haven't seen 1917 yet, so I'll qualify that. That's supposed to be a very good movie. Now, 1963. Oh boy, this one is a biggie. Cleopatra. Richard Burton, Elizabeth Taylor. One of the most, I think it was the most expensive movie ever made at the time. And by the way, it was a box office flop. It was a disaster. In fact, it almost bankrupted the movie studio. If you watch this movie, you can see why. They have a cast of thousands of extras. There's a scene when Cleopatra goes to Rome. There's a huge entourage, and of course, this wasn't CGI. These were actual actors and so on. Of course, while they were making this, Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, who were both married to other people at the time, carried on a huge affair, and it blew up all over the newspapers. I guess they thought that would lead to box office bonanza. but it didn't. It was a big flop. I believe it almost drove the film company into bankruptcy. But it is worth seeing, and of course now you can see it, and you don't have to worry about spending a lot of money on it. So there you have it. 1964, another movie, Zulu. So this is about the British stand at Rorke's Drift. And it does a pretty decent job of portraying the Zulus, not necessarily as villains, but just as other, a different culture. It is a very pro-British Victorian mannerisms to the characters. Michael Caine, of course, is great in this movie, playing his character. He's Lieutenant Bromhead or Bromhead, I believe it is. So that's interesting. And if you like seeing things like uniforms of that late Victorian time period, it was 1870s sometime, it's neat and interesting to see that. 1965, there's a movie here called The Heroes of Telemark. Now, this is based on an actual story about some Norwegian, what would you call them, like special agents trained by the British, who take out the heavy water plant that the Germans were using. The Germans, of course, had occupied Norway, and the Germans were developing the atomic bomb, and they needed heavy water. And this is, once again, based on an actual story. Now, some of it's probably fictionalized. I don't know how accurate this is, but it's an entertaining movie. And it's different. It's not your typical people going in, shooting up in a commando raid, and so on. 1966 brings us up to the Blue Max. George Peppard, German World War I fighter pilot. And, the story here is probably not the greatest, but I just loved seeing those aircraft flying around. So to me, that was a very interesting to see all that. And of course, they were using models or aircraft and not CGI trickery. And I haven't seen this lately, so I can't tell you if the effects still stand up, but it is entertaining from that perspective. Now, if you're not into World War I aircraft, probably that was one you would want to miss. 1968, here's one that if you like action-adventure movies and you liked The Guns of Navarone, the same author created Where Eagles Dare. Now, this one has, let me think. I can't remember who's in it now. My brain's fried, apparently.
Which one?
Where Eagles Dare. I know it's got Clint Eastwood, one of his first sort of mainstream movies, pardon me. And the other one is, Richard Burton. Richard Burton is the British commander. And Clint Eastwood basically just shoots everything in sight and blows stuff up. Entertaining movie. They're going in to kill a double agent who's working with the Germans, and he's up in this nest up in the mountains that you have to get to with a cable car. There's an epic cable car fight, which is really cool if you like that kind of stuff. The very next year, 60s and 70s were good for war movies, I gotta say. 1969, one of my favorite war movies of all time, The Battle of Britain. This has some wonderful shots of aircraft and dogfighting. They have a lot of historically accurate aircraft. No models here. These are actual aircraft. Very, very entertaining. It's got lots of people in it. Once again, it does a really good job, like a lot of these other ones, of explaining the situation and what's going into it. Well, Christopher Plummer is also in this one. He plays a Canadian pilot, so you get that sort of Canadian perspective, which is fun for me as a Canadian to see. 1970, I've got two movies in 1970. The first is a movie about the attack on Pearl Harbor called Tora, Tora, Tora. It's funny, I remember as a kid staying up late to watch this show. It was on really, really late. I can't remember how old I was at the time. And it was on TV. And so, and of course, in those days, we couldn't record it. I remember falling asleep just as the aircraft were taking off on the aircraft carriers and waking up as they were landing. So I basically missed everything. Now, of course, I got to see it later. Entertaining movie. They did a good job of sort of showing both sides. And I also want to mention, I didn't put this other one on here, but while I'm talking about Tora, 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 another movie was Midway. Not the new one. Haven't seen that yet. but the original. And that followed the same sort of idea of having an all-star cast. Now, the advantage of having an all-star cast is it becomes much easier to identify the characters just because you're familiar with the actors. So in this case, it really works. Henry Fonda's in there and a whole bunch of other people, too many to mention. The same year, I do have Midway on here. The same year that Tora Tora Terror came out, we have the movie Patton. George C. Scott gives an amazing performance. I have this one on Blu-ray, I think, actually, not just DVD. He won an Academy Award for this, if I'm not mistaken, and it's about his wartime record. It doesn't really go into his past before the war, but it's a very good movie. The only thing that bothered me about this movie is that they're using more modern tanks, but I guess that's, based on what they had available at the time. But still a very interesting movie. And Patton was a very controversial figure, and they don't steer away from that in the movie. 1976, this is where Midway came out, which I've already mentioned. And another favorite of mine, another Alistair MacLean story, The Eagle Has Landed. So this is... I believe it's northern England, might even be Scotland. I can't recall the exact location, but basically German spies try to assassinate Winston Churchill. Donald Sutherland is in it, by the way, he does a really good job as well. So The Eagle Has Landed, very entertaining movie. The very next year, 1977, another movie, and this one I have on DVD. This is A Bridge Too Far. It's about the assault on Arnhem, which was in World War II, also called Operation Market Garden. This has some really stellar performances in it. Once again, lots of big names. Michael Caine's in it. Robert Redford's in it. Anthony Hopkins is in it. Michael Caine is in it. Tons and tons of people in it. And really, it switches around to tell the story from different people's point of view. So Sean Connery is one of the British paratroopers, along with Anthony Hopkins, that lands at the bridge at Arnhem, which is too far along the way, they get sort of stuck in a nasty situation, if you're familiar with that. The Americans, of course, are coming up with 30 Corps and trying to build bridges and get the Armored Corps up, and Michael Caine is a tank commander. So very interesting. Once again, they did a good job of explaining what's going on with the whole picture, so you get to see some of the planning in it. So very, very entertaining. One of my favorite war movies. Jumping to 1981, here's a movie, I believe they've remade this one as well. It's called Das Boot, and it's about a U-boat crew and captain and so on. It's got to be one of the most claustrophobic movies you've ever seen. They built... the set is actually either an actual submarine or a mock-up of a World War II submarine, but it feels very, very claustrophobic. If you are claustrophobic, you probably would not want to watch this movie, just saying. But very, very gritty, very, very interesting as well. 1989, I'm going to skip through most of the 80s, and I apologize if I missed some of your favorites in here. There are just too many movies to talk about. Another movie I really enjoyed, Glory, came out in 1989. This is about a regiment of black soldiers during the American Civil War. They have a white officer. It's got, Denzel Washington, I believe, is in it. Matthew Broderick, I think, is their white officer. Very entertaining, stirring movie. It goes into the prejudice they face, but it's more about the battle, from what I remember. Very entertaining movie. 1992, we have Last of the Mohicans. Now, this one has been made several times. This is the one with Daniel Day-Lewis, which I thought was a very good job that he did. Of course, Daniel Day-Lewis is known for doing Lincoln and My Left Foot. He really gets into the characters. So I thought that was a very good adaptation. My understanding is it's very close to the book, which is James Fenimore Cooper's book, I believe. Moving forward, we have Schindler's List, 1993. Wow, this one's a real tearjerker, gripping. Shot in black and white with a couple of splashes of color to draw attention to things. Of course, it tells the story of Oskar Schindler, who was played by Liam Neeson, and Ben Kingsley is in it as well as his assistant, who's Jewish, and that, of course, works in because he has to deal with smuggling Jews out of Germany and helping them avoid the concentration and extermination camps. Very good movie. It's a longer one too, if I recall, and this is something that maybe they should teach it in schools. Very, very hard to watch too, I should mention, disturbing. 1995. Oh, one of the most reviled historical movies ever, Braveheart. Now, there are so many issues with this movie from a historical point of view that I don't want to even get into it. It tells the supposed story of William Wallace. Now, William Wallace had an interesting story to begin with, but for Hollywood reasons, Mel Gibson decided to put all kinds of historical inaccuracies into this movie. Still an entertaining movie, though. Just treat it as fiction. Don't worry about the history. I think you'll still find it's an entertaining tale. Okay? And that could also be said for one I'm going to mention later with Mel Gibson in it. But I'll come back to that later. So yeah, Braveheart, entertaining. If you're a history buff, some things are going to annoy you. I know they did for me. But still, if you can put that aside, you can enjoy the movie. Also, the same year, Apollo 13. Wow. Incredible movie. They did this is another Steven Spielberg, if I recall. Tom Hanks, of course, was in it, along with quite a few other well-known names. Gary Sinise, I can't remember the other fellow's name. Anyway, Apollo 13 gives you a very good idea of what was going on. If you're not familiar with Apollo 13, well, they went to the moon, something went wrong, and they didn't know if they could bring them back. So it required a lot of brain power and a lot of thinking and so on to bring them back safely to Earth, which they did. It could have ended in a disaster. So it's a very, very interesting movie. 1998, Saving Private Ryan, probably one of the best American-made war movies I've ever seen. Steven Spielberg made this with Tom Hanks again, and I believe this was he did this for his father, who served in the army. Very gritty. The combat scenes are incredible. You'd swear you're right in the middle of combat. So very, very interesting movie, that one. The same year, Cate Blanchett was in Elizabeth. Now, I got kind of a soft spot for these kinds of historical movies about Queen Elizabeth I. This one I really enjoyed. It's about her younger life. Now, later on, she did Elizabeth the Golden Years, which is a bit later in her career and includes the Spanish Armada. I liked both movies. The second one was a little slower. I think the first one was a little more interesting from a perspective of politics and so on. But she did an outstanding job. I believe she won the Academy Award for that, but don't quote me on that. I didn't double check that. So that was 1998. Now, coming right after that, 1999, we have The Messenger, which is the story of Joan of Arc. Now, if you go into IMDb and type in The Messenger, there's tons of movies called The Messenger. This movie is about Joan of Arc. It stars Mila Jovovich. You probably know her from Resident Evil franchise and various other action-packed movies. I like this version. There was another version, the name escapes me. It had Lila Sobieski in it. It was pretty decent as well. It's obviously told from a pro-Joan point of view, so it's inspiring, but also, I mean, Joan of Arc really gets betrayed by her own country in the end. It's not a happy ending, but well-made movie. I liked it. Once again, I'm not sure how historically accurate it was, but I thought pacing and so on. I liked the movie. It's always nice to see people rolling around with armor and whacking away at each other and so on. 2000, two movies here. The first one, Russell Crowe. You can probably guess what I'm going to say. Oh, maybe not, because he's in another one I'm going to mention. The Gladiator, or pardon me, just Gladiator. This is actually a remake of a really old movie. And of course he is something Maximus. He's a Roman centurion, and he's basically, my understanding is they're making a sequel to this, which is weird because he dies in the end. Everybody knows he dies in the end, so I'm not sure how they're going to do that. But Gladiator is Russell Crowe at probably one of his best roles. He's done lots of other decent movies too, of course. That same year, another movie that's reviled for this historical inaccuracies, The Patriot, Mel Gibson. the big issue here, of course, is the villain of the piece is a British guy called Tarleton, and there actually was a Tarleton person in the British Army, and he didn't do any of the things that they have the villain do, but still makes an entertaining story. So Mel Gibson, and I believe it's got, who has it got in it? It's got the Australian actor who played the Joker, and now the name's not coming up here to me.
Heath Ledger?
Yeah, Heath Ledger, that's right. Heath Ledger is one of his sons, or his son anyway. This is a nice, interesting take on the Revolutionary War from the rebel perspective, or the American perspective. Entertaining story. If you know, obviously the villain's got to be a villainous villain, so he's going to do some nasty things. I kind of liked it. I like seeing that time period portrayed, lots of neat battle scenes, and it's a bit grim. It kind of gets across the horror of war and this kind of thing as well. 2001, we have, this is a movie that quite surprised me actually, Enemy at the Gates, based on the story of the Soviet sniper Vasily, I want to say Zykov, I may have his last name incorrect. Jude Law is the sniper. They added in Rachel Weisz as kind of a love interest. I have no idea if that's historically accurate or not. Oh, and then they throw in Ed Harris as this rival German sniper, which has nothing to do with history, but does give him something to sort of play off against to add some tension to the story. Otherwise, he would just be running around shooting people, and that would be the end of it. 2003, another Russell Crowe movie I really enjoyed, Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World. These are based on the Aubrey Maturin books, based on two books actually. So Master and Commander was one, Far Side of the World was another separate book. I read the books. I found the books were okay. I much preferred Hornblower and I have several other series that I really enjoy from a naval perspective. So anyway, I do like Master and Commander because it does a really good job of showing the grittiness aboard ship, which I really enjoyed. And the ship itself is amazing to see if you like those sailing ships and so on. 2005, I've only got a couple left. I didn't go too recent just because there are too many movies. There seems to be a whole spate of them coming out recently. 2005, though, I want to mention Kingdom of Heaven. So this is another huge spectacle, and it's got Orlando Bloom in the lead role. Liam Neeson is there as well as this sort of mentor, his father, although he's not in a lot of the movie. It's got some other pretty well-known names in it. The battle scenes are amazing. Of course, by now they're using CGI and so on to recreate some of this. The Siege of Jerusalem is epic to behold. I really liked the sort of the take on the relations between the Christian forces and the forces of the Saracens and so on, because they portrayed them as just another culture. They weren't demonized or anything, and in fact they actually get along for quite a large period of this, and that was very common during the Crusades actually. So Kingdom of Heaven is really good. The last movie I'm going to mention, and this technically is a bit newer, 2008, Passchendaele. So this, I have to mention this, it's an epic World War I movie. It was, when it was made, the biggest funded Canadian war movie ever made, and I quite enjoyed it. The action scenes are incredible. They're based actually on actual accounts of things that happened. Passchendaele, of course, was a very muddy battle with a high death toll and so on in World War I. They recreated the trenches in an amazing job. They filmed it in Alberta, actually, and they built and flooded fields and everything in order to make this thing. I found it quite interesting. I think I mentioned it previously. I did a blog posting on Remembrance Day, November 11th, and I mentioned Canadian war movies, and this is one of them. But even ignoring that, it's to me, I thought it was a very well done movie. They also added a bit of flavor to the home side of things, what was happening in Canada at the time. So it's kind of neat to see that perspective, and the Canadian perspective is a little different than you might get from American or British, let's say, especially for World War I. So that's let's see. Let's take a look at the board here. What's going on? So today is the 27th, which means in 4 days, my next book, Embers, is due out. And so we've been working hard to get that posted for you at all the major online retailers. And that goes live on January 31st. And so that would be this Friday. Wow, that's coming up soon, isn't it? That's about it for now. It's taken a long time to get here, but we'll see you in 2 weeks' time.